like to first mention that material on school shooters will be found in another video that I will have linked for you, and you can review that one. And so I won't cover that material in this video. But I did want to go ahead and start with a warning, and that is a warning that there may be television shows, there may be people out there who will tell you that they have predictors of who becomes a killer or a serial killer. And these are very, very problematic. These lists basically are not that helpful, and they can be harmful. As you'll see in the readings, there's a discussion about labeling theory and how when people are labeled in a particular way, that can lead to primary deviance and secondary deviance. The person may be labeled in a negative way, and then they may incorporate that into their self, and then they may act out how they are expected to act out in a negative way. And so it's very important to avoid labeling, for example, juveniles who exhibit some of the characteristics that are on some of these checklists. For example, I once saw a television show where the speaker, the host of the show, said basically, do you want to know if your kid or your neighborhood kids are serial killers or going to be serial killers? Here's a checklist. It just does not work that way. Those checklists tend to be very imprecise, ambivalent, and they fail often to predict homicidal behavior. There are certainly risk factors that we talk about throughout the semester, but there's not this clear-cut method of determining who will become a killer and who will not. One area that is covered in your book is the Mcdonald Triad, basically, which is seen as indicating there are problems among, for example, juvenile people in the population. For example, the triad consists of three major behaviors that are seen as very problematic. One is fire setting. The second one is animal cruelty or abusing and torturing animals. And the third one is enuresis or bedwetting. And even though some serial killers have shown these three characteristics, there are a lot of kids that have these characteristics that do not become serial killers. It can show you that things are not going well in that juvenile's life, perhaps, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to become a violent, dangerous person as an adult. Basically, it tells us it's time for a mental health intervention and try to help the person find out what's going on and offer some clinical counseling assistance. In other words, preventive measures. So the triad's not a good predictor of later adult violence, and there hasn't been studies that validated this measure as well. But since we do see a relationship, that those certainly would be indicators that someone needs to follow up and help that person try to find out what's going on. And another area that is discussed in your textbook is the cyclical nature of serial killing. And you'll see in the trauma control model that your author presents that there's this cyclical pattern where, for example, the killer has fantasies, and those fantasies may be encouraged by certain events or things that the offender views or uses. The example given in your textbook would be pornography or alcohol, and that can be seen as basically increasing some of those negative violent fantasies, and also traumas that are experienced in everyday life, and major traumas that occur during the life cycle. And so there becomes this fulfilling or self-perpetuating rather cycle of having these fantasies and then leading to some behaviors and then increasing the extent of the behaviors and then engaging in more violent behavior, culminating in for our cases, murder and serial murder. So you can see from the model that your author points out that there's some predispositional factors and some facilitators. And this shows that, in other words, there's some predispositions that may be risk factors. For example, head trauma, certain biological, biochemical, abnormalities, we might say. And then these other factors, for example, low self-esteem and having violent fantasies about killing, torturing, and the like. And then having this whole process being reinforced and cycled, including dissociation, which was discussed in your textbook as well. And so a lot of this material focuses on trauma, childhood trauma. For example, severe childhood abuse or neglect, and also rejection, which would clearly fall under the area of emotional child abuse. Rejection by the parent or parental figures or caretakers seems to lead to a lot of problems. Now, interestingly enough, that a lot of the stuff I just said, to relate it to serial murder, these are relatively very rare cases. But a lot of times we'll see that people who are rejected, people who have childhood traumas, cope with the situations and do very well and are law-abiding citizens. So again, I don't want these to be considered these markers that we should label a person who shows any of these or has experienced any of these situations. Not at all. If you're thinking, well, I'm not really being precise and clear, and I'm a little ambivalent and ambiguous about the whole situation, you're right. I would rather try to present, that we still have a lot of work to do in the field, and there's a lot of unanswered questions, than to try to falsely claim that we know it all. And so we can see some of these scenarios playing out. The media violence has become a very, very debatable issue and very controversial. And it appears that there is that relationship that some adolescents or adults may use violent video games or violent pornography or violent movies to kind of fuel and add encouragement to their deviant, violent fantasies to start with. So probably there is a group of juveniles who are at greater risk for watching violent videos and then engaging in violent behavior. And then there are many juveniles who would watch the violent videos and then would be law-abiding, nonviolent citizens. So that whole idea of risk becomes problematic as well, because we're talking about probabilities rather than a yes/no, that person will or will not engage in that behavior. But it does appear that we need to consider, especially we've seen, for example, we've seen a couple cases with school shooters where they became very proficient in their accuracy in shooting by playing particular shooting video games where they were using a toy gun basically with the video game to become a very proficient marksman, and so that can become problematic as well. There's an interesting article just in the New York Times saying basically, yeah, it seemed like it is something to look at further and is a problem. There's been a lot of debate about this research, so I don't want you to think that we have the final answer on this as well. And so this chapter began to look at social factors, and to kind of back up for a moment, looked at social structural factors, for example, how the economy and the political system and the educational system, all these large institutions interact to increase or decrease the risk of violent behavior in communities and among individuals and families, and with social class, socioeconomic status being a very important factor, especially as it relates to health in general. And then social process theories were discussed, neutralization theory was discussed how offenders, whether they be serial murderers or some other type of offender, often will try to neutralize the criminal activity or explain it away by using different explanations. And so you can read about that as well and see how that does indeed, apply, and the negative ways that people who engage in violent behavior try to explain away their behavior. For example, that they may say that they really didn't harm anyone, or that what they were doing was important, or they didn't have control. And so there's these different methods that are used, and you'll see that if you listen to interviews with offenders. So again, this chapter gives us a lot of information, but also provides some important criticisms, critiques, and shows us that we don't have this precise science, and that there still is a lot of unknown variables, a lot of questions we still must answer. Thank you.